Right, so the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories, the brilliant Francesca Albanese, has stood before the UN Human Rights Council this week and spelt out in a speech her assessment of the situation in Gaza at the hands of Israel since October 7th, and that she believes the case for the commission of the crime of genocide as laid out under the terms of the Genocide Convention has been met, and that the UN must now act accordingly to impose immediate sanctions and an arms embargo on the apartheid state, who have lashed out at her to no surprise whatsoever, despite not actually turning up to hear her speech, and indeed Albanese has admitted to having received threats due to her work and her findings, very much implying she's touched a nerve, and her findings, strongly worded as they are very much sadly on the money.
Following nearly 6 months of unrelenting Israeli assault on occupied Gaza, it is my solemn duty to report on the worst of what humanity is capable of and to present my finding: the anatomy of a genocide. One of my key findings is that Israel's executive and military leadership and soldiers have intentionally distorted rules of international humanitarian law, distinction, proportionality and precaution in an attempt to legitimize genocidal violence against the Palestinian people by deliberately stretching the definitions of human shield, evacuation orders, warnings, safe zones, collateral damage and medical protection. Israel has used their protective function as humanitarian camouflage, with the effect of concealing patterns of conduct from which the only inference can reasonably be drawn is a state policy of genocidal violence against the Palestinians. In light of this, I find that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide against Palestinians as a group in Gaza has been met. Specifically, Israel has committed 3 acts of genocide with the requisite intent: causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group.
Right, so that was Francesca Albanese presenting her anatomy of a genocide to the UN Human Rights Council on Tuesday, and frankly I defy anyone to disagree with anything she said in that clip there, which is a sample of a much fuller 20-minute long speech, I think it was all told. If the Genocide Convention that so many countries are signatories of, including Israel and those nations arming Israel right now, means anything, then sanctions and an arms embargo must follow. But as ever, where it comes to the UN, especially in light of what is going on in Gaza, for too many nations the UN just never seems to be seen in that way. It looks good to be signed up to UN treaties and conventions on this, that and the other, but when it comes to meeting the terms of them, there just seems to be a pervading attitude of it not mattering very much. But the UN won't enforce these things, therefore why should we follow them? And certainly there is a justifiable anger towards the UN at times for seeming to not be willing to uphold its own rules and regs. A classic example that we've all observed is the International Court of Justice ruling against Israel that was brought by South Africa, which laid down several orders back in January, all but one of which Israel have seemingly flouted. Twice since South Africa delegates have tried to get the ICJ, which is a branch of the UN itself, to toughen up its stance on Israel, and twice over they've declined to do so, despite Israel blatantly ignoring those orders. The only ICJ order that Israel have apparently followed was the one to submit a report spelling out how they were upholding all the other orders that were handed down to them, which they did. And many of us snorted in derision when we heard this, as aid has been prevented from getting in and the genocide has just continued without pause. But as much as we'd all love to know what Israel said to the UN, what they submitted, so we can almost certainly shred it for its abject dishonesty, it's never been made public. The ICJ, a branch of the UN, as I mentioned before, they came to a ruling that most of the world supported. But when it comes down to it, it now just feels like they're helping Israel out again by not upholding their own rulings, their own orders, and that's hugely disappointing. It's a horrible headspace to be in when we expect it differently, even if the composition of the ICJ is now changed since that ruling was made back in January, especially since the current president of the court now happens to be Lebanese, a nation with significant beef with Israel, as I'm sure you can appreciate. then perhaps the caution that appears to be on show there is a signal of him trying to avoid any accusations of bias by Israel. But come on, they would come anyway. If so, it's coming across instead as letting Israel off the hook a little bit right now. At any rate, Francesca Albanese certainly was not letting Israel off the hook. And as the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories, Special Rapporteurs are all lawyers, human rights experts. They're mandated to report and advise on specific human rights themes and crises. That is what they do. And Albanese's job is made none the easier by Israel, who have banned her from entering Palestine. That's one sure way to make sure she can't actually see what's happening with her own eyes. But she doesn't have to, because it's playing across social media in real time. And we have journalists, thankfully, on the ground risking their lives to get information out about what is actually happening. And also, Albanese's built up her own reputation for being doggedly determined in her investigations and investigating to the full, despite obstacles others might place in her way. And her many media appearances have won her much in the way of plaudits and admiration for talking straight and not tolerating any amount of bullshit. Therefore, her anatomy of a genocide speech cut through, especially as she made it clear by the end that she feels Israel is in violation of the Genocide Convention and is committing the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. You have to appreciate the ramifications of this and how damning these accusations are against the apartheid state that prefers to style itself as a Jewish state, more often than not so it can hide behind excuses of racism against any who might seek to hold them to account for their actions. The Genocide Convention was itself set up in response to the Nazi genocides against Jewish people and other demographics too. It's not unique to Jews. The Roma Gypsies were targeted. The disabled were targeted as other for instances. So to be held to account against a convention set up so that the horrors of the Holocaust could never be repeated, for a Jewish state, as it calls itself, no less to be charged with that. You can understand that they would be very angry about that and why they have readily played the victim card over this. But the Genocide Convention is also very specific in the 5 acts of genocide it describes. And Albanese has levelled accusations against Israel for having committed 3 of those 5 acts. And actually there's little argument against that, because this atrocity, as I said a moment ago, being committed in Gaza is playing out in real time before us all across social media. As Albanese has called it, it is the worst of what humanity is capable of. Albanese has stated that the threshold genocide has been met in 3 acts of genocide. The act of causing serious physical and mental harm to members of the group, in this case the Gazan people, deliberately inflicting upon members of the group conditions for life intended to bring about in whole or in part the destruction of members of the group, and imposing measures designed to prevent births within the group. On the first act, 100,000 dead or injured Gazan civilians are proof of that, where before the mainstream news used to insulate us in the West against such bloody scenes. Now they have become daily scenes for us on social media, kids with their limbs having been amputated off without anaesthetic or having starved to death, their skin as thin as paper. On the second act, Albanese mentioned, we have seen Israel systematically levelling Gaza from north to south, where homes are destroyed, schools are destroyed, hospitals rendered completely inoperable, staff taken prisoner or killed as well, along with aid workers. There is no distinction being demonstrated between who is Hamas and who is not in Gaza. And on the third act, this isn't so much something that has been witnessed, but has been documented, where contraceptives have been administered without consent. So as difficult as it might be for some to make the comparison, and I must admit to uneasiness in making the comparison myself, the conduct of the Nazis, an evil beyond comprehension for so many of us who never lived through that, between how Israel are acting in Gaza and how the Nazis behaved during World War II, Israel has fallen afoul, demonstrably, in the view of the Special Rapporteur, and in the eyes of many people around the world, of a convention to prevent genocide created precisely because of what the Nazis did. Israel have, of course, rejected her findings, so what a surprise that is to us all. The US have also done likewise, no real surprise there either. But I'll take Albanese's findings 100 times over before I listen to either of those nation states on this matter, and their spokespeople, as involved as both of those nations are. It's also probably no surprise that Albanese herself has received threats because of her findings, because of her speech. Al Jazeera have reported that, asked whether her work on the report had caused her to receive threats, Albanese said, yes, I do receive threats. Nothing that so far I considered needing extra precautions, Pressure, yes, and it doesn't change either my commitment or the result of my work. Albanese, who has held the position since 2022, did not elaborate on the nature of the threats, nor did she say who had issued them. It's been a difficult time, she said. I've always been attacked since the very beginning of my mandate. Israel has criticised Albanese, saying she was delegitimizing the very creation and existence of the State of Israel. Albanese denied the accusation. Ultimately, this finding isn't telling many of us something we didn't already know. But it's a report to the UN by a UN appointee. It therefore carries weight as far as they're concerned. It should. And again puts more pressure on the UN, as it should, to do something meaningful and apply pressure to member states involved here and those who are just looking on, sitting on their hands, to start looking at arms embargoes and sanctions. They need to be applied. We know they work. We saw it work in apartheid South Africa. It can be done again here and now, and it needs to be. Of course, all of this has come hot on the heels of the UN Security Council voting through a ceasefire for Ramadan. Israel's reaction to that was more airstrikes on Rafah, as we've seen, where the vast majority of the remaining Gaza population, innocent civilian population, are huddled up. And of course, Israel have blamed everyone, everything and their cat as being anti-Semitic for daring to criticise them, for allowing this vote to go through. And they got major beef with the US themselves now, without whom they'd be sunk. But try telling them that, for abstaining on that vote instead of protecting Israel as usual and vetoing it. You can get the latest details on their most recent whinge in this video recommendation here. And I'll hope to catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.